I rented a cheap Airbnb, but every night I heard footsteps upstairs. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw the price. Every other Airbnb in that area was around $180 a night. This one was barely $70. The photos looked amazing. Hundreds of 5-star reviews. Great location. Everything seemed perfect. Looking back now, I would have gladly paid 3 times as much if it meant avoiding what happened during that week. After months of non-stop work, I decided to spend a few days in a quiet mountain town in Colorado. I wasn't looking for luxury. I just wanted silence, fresh air, and a place where nobody knew me. That's exactly what this Airbnb seemed to offer. A few hours after booking it, I received a message from the host. His name was Michael. Most of the message was exactly what you'd expect. Check-in instructions, Wi-Fi password, parking information, but the last sentence caught my attention. There's just one house rule I'd like to explain when you arrive. I assumed it would be something simple. Maybe he didn't want guests smoking inside. Maybe the neighbors complained about loud music. Nothing unusual. At least, that's what I thought while driving toward the property that Friday afternoon. Michael was already waiting outside when I pulled into the driveway. He looked to be in his early 50s, friendly, well-dressed, and surprisingly calm. He gave me a quick tour of the house. The kitchen was spotless. The living room overlooked the forest. Everything looked even better than it had in the photos. Just before handing me the keys, he suddenly stopped talking. He glanced toward the ceiling for a second before looking back at me. "You might hear footsteps upstairs at night," he said. Then he smiled. "Don't worry about them." The way he said it made me far more uncomfortable than the words themselves. He instinctively looked up from the outside. The house clearly had 2 floors, but during the tour, we'd only walked through the first one. I assumed the upper floor was private. Maybe he stored personal belongings there. It wasn't really my business. As Michael walked back to his truck, he turned around one last time. "Oh, and one more thing. If you hear the footsteps, don't go upstairs. I think you'll understand tomorrow." Before I could ask what he meant, he got into his truck and drove away. I laughed to myself after he left. Maybe he was just an eccentric host trying to make the stay more interesting. I unpacked my bags, grabbed dinner in town, and spent the evening walking through the quiet streets. It was the kind of place where you could hear your own footsteps echo after sunset. Around 11 that night, I climbed into bed and started reading. I must have been half asleep when I heard it. One step, then another, then another. Someone was slowly walking directly above my bedroom, not running, not pacing nervously, just walking back and forth with the same steady rhythm. I sat up in bed, convinced Michael had come back without telling me. I checked my phone. 2:17 a.m. The footsteps continued above me at the same slow, steady pace. They didn't sound rushed or random. Whoever was up there seemed to be following the exact same path over and over again. After a few minutes, I got out of bed and quietly opened my bedroom door. The hallway was dark, and the staircase leading upstairs was only a few feet away. I stood there listening. The footsteps sounded even louder from the bottom of the stairs. I placed my hand on the railing, then remembered Michael's warning. "If you hear the footsteps, don't go upstairs." I kept replaying those words in my head. Was he trying to protect his privacy, or was there another reason? After standing there for almost a minute, I stepped back, closed my bedroom door, and convinced myself I'd ask him about it in the morning. The next morning, everything looked completely normal. Sunlight filled the living room, birds were singing outside, and there wasn't a single sign that anyone had been upstairs during the night. No voices, no footsteps, no doors opening or closing. It almost made me wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Before leaving for breakfast, I opened the Airbnb listing again. That's when I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. The description clearly said the property was an entire home rental. No shared spaces, no other guests, no mention of the upstairs being occupied. That detail stayed with me for the rest of the day. If the house wasn't shared with anyone, then who had been walking upstairs? I tried coming up with logical explanations, but every answer created another question. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. That afternoon, I met an older woman watering flowers across the street. After a short conversation, she asked if I was staying at Michael's house. I smiled and said yes. Her expression changed immediately. She looked toward the house and quietly asked, "So, you've heard the footsteps too, haven't you?" I froze. I hadn't mentioned the noises to anyone. Before I could answer, she realized what she'd just said. Her face turned pale. "Forget I asked," she whispered. Then she picked up her watering can, walked back inside, and closed the front door without another word. For the first time, I knew the footsteps weren't just in my head. Someone else knew about them. Maybe several people did. Whatever was happening in that house had been happening long before I arrived, and Michael had clearly chosen not to tell me the whole story. That evening, I made a decision. I placed my phone on the nightstand, opened the voice recording app, and plugged it into the charger. If those footsteps came back, I wanted proof. I had no idea that recording would become the most important clue in the entire mystery. The footsteps started again the following night. I checked the time before they even reached my bedroom. 2:16 a.m., exactly the same as before. This time I stayed completely still, letting my phone record every second. The pattern never changed. Slow footsteps, a short pause, then the same route all over again. The next morning, I listened to the recording through my headphones. The footsteps sounded even clearer than I remembered, but something felt strangely off. Every step was almost perfectly spaced, as if whoever was walking had memorized the exact distance between each one. I sent the audio to a close friend of mine who worked as a structural engineer. I didn't tell him the full story. I simply asked if the sound could be caused by an old wooden house. A couple of hours later, he replied with a message that immediately caught my attention. "That doesn't sound like creaking wood. Those are real footsteps." Reading those words made my stomach tighten. Up until then, I'd been trying to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. But hearing someone else reach the same conclusion made it much harder to ignore. If they really were footsteps, then someone had been above me every single night. That afternoon, I finally called Michael. I told him I'd recorded the noises and asked if he could explain what was happening. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. "Do they still start at exactly 2:16? I hadn't mentioned the time, not once. I asked him how he knew that, but he ignored the question. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said calmly. "I think you've heard enough." Before I could ask anything else, the call ended. That conversation lasted less than a minute, but it completely changed the way I saw Michael. Until then, I'd assumed he was hiding something out of embarrassment. Now I wasn't so sure. He sounded like someone who had been waiting for this call. The following night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise inside the house made me glance at the clock. At exactly 2:15 a.m., headlights swept across the bedroom wall. A car had just pulled into the driveway. I carefully looked through the curtains, expecting to see Michael. The engine shut off, but nobody got out. The vehicle remained completely still. I couldn't make out the driver's face through the windshield. Then I looked back at my phone. The clock changed to 2:16, and the footsteps started upstairs once again. I stood frozen between the window and the bedroom door. Someone was sitting outside in a parked car while another person, or something, was walking above my room. For the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that those two things were somehow connected. Michael arrived the next afternoon, looking completely different from the man who had handed me the keys a few days earlier. He barely smiled. The first thing he asked for was my phone. Without saying a word, he put on a pair of headphones and listened to the entire recording from beginning to end. When it was over, he slowly placed the phone on the kitchen table. "I'm staying here tonight," he said. I asked why. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I need to see if it still happens the way I remember." That sentence left me with more questions than answers. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about everything except the footsteps. It almost felt intentional. Every few minutes, though, I'd catch Michael staring at the clock on the wall. He wasn't nervous. He looked like someone counting down to a moment he knew was coming. Just before 2 in the morning, we turned off every light in the house. Michael sat quietly in the living room facing the staircase, while I stayed in my bedroom with the door slightly open. The silence was so complete, I could hear the old clock ticking from the kitchen. At exactly 2:15, headlights appeared through the front window again. The same car had returned. Michael walked over, pulled the curtain aside just enough to look outside, then calmly sat back down without saying a word. It was obvious he'd been expecting it. 1 minute later, the footsteps began, slow, even, always following the same route. Michael closed his eyes and quietly counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. He wasn't reacting with fear. He was measuring something. When the footsteps finally stopped, Michael stood up and walked toward the staircase. I thought he was finally going upstairs. Instead, he stopped on the very first step, listened for a few seconds, then slowly came back down. "Fewer than yesterday," he whispered. I stared at him in disbelief. "How do you know how many there were yesterday?" Before he could answer, his phone rang. He looked at the screen, picked up immediately, and only said 2 words. Again, "Yes." Then he ended the call. "Who was that?" I asked. Michael slipped the phone into his pocket before answering. "The man who lives behind the property." He paused for a second. He heard them too. Suddenly, I realized this wasn't just happening inside this house. Until that moment, I'd believed the mystery belonged to one building. Now I knew at least one other person had been hearing the exact same footsteps at the exact same time. Whatever was causing them, it was bigger than either of us had imagined. The next morning, Michael walked across the backyard toward the house behind mine. An older man answered the door after a few knocks. They spoke quietly for several minutes while I waited on the porch. When Michael finally came back, I could tell something had changed. For the first time since we'd met, he looked genuinely worried. A sat across from me at the kitchen table and took a deep breath. "You're not the first guest who's told me about the footsteps," he admitted. Several people had mentioned them over the years. A few had even checked out early. But none of them had ever filed a complaint because they assumed nobody would believe them. I couldn't understand why he'd kept renting the house if this had been happening for so long. He looked down at his hands before answering. "Because I needed the money," he said quietly. The house had belonged to his parents, and selling it had become almost impossible once the rumor started spreading around town. "So why didn't you investigate?" I asked. Michael gave a tired smile. "I did. He told me he'd hired contractors, inspected the attic, replaced sections of the flooring, and even installed security cameras upstairs. Every single time, the result had been exactly the same. Nothing. No person. No explanation." That caught my attention immediately. "What did the cameras record?" I asked. Instead of answering, Michael stood up, opened an old cabinet in the living room, and pulled out a dusty storage box. Inside were hard drives, memory cards, and a worn notebook filled with handwritten dates. He opened the notebook to a random page and slid it across the table. Every entry looked almost identical. A date, the time, 2:16 a.m., and a number beside it. 6 footsteps, 11 footsteps, 9 footsteps, 14 footsteps. He'd been documenting them for years. "What do the numbers mean?" I asked. Michael explained that the footsteps never lasted the same amount of time.
Some nights they ended after a few seconds. Other nights they continued for nearly 15 minutes. The only thing that never changed was the exact time they began.
Just then my phone buzzed. It was my engineer friend. He then analyzed the recording using audio software from his office. His message was only one sentence long. There's something strange about this recording. The footsteps aren't coming from above you. I read the message twice before playing the recording again. The more I listened, the more I understood what he meant. My brain had assumed the sound was coming from upstairs, but the recording didn't actually prove that. It only proved one thing. Someone, or something, wanted us to believe it was upstairs. Michael took the phone from my hands and replayed the recording several times without speaking. When it ended, he slowly looked up at me. His face had gone pale. "Then we've been searching in the wrong place all these years," he said quietly. Michael spent the next hour walking through every room in the house with the recording playing through a portable speaker. He stopped in the hallway several times, listening carefully before tapping different walls with his knuckles. Most sounded solid. One section, near the staircase, echoed differently, hollow, much more hollow. We examined that wall from top to bottom, expecting to find some hidden access panel or signs of an old renovation. There was nothing unusual about it. Fresh paint, no cracks, no loose boards, yet every knock produced the same deep, empty sound, as if there was far more space behind it than there should have been. Michael stood there quietly for a long time before saying something he'd never mentioned before. "This isn't the original house." I looked at him, confused. He explained that his grandfather had built a much smaller cabin nearly 80 years earlier. The house had been expanded several times, and he had never seen the original blueprints. That afternoon we drove to the county records office, hoping the original plans still existed. After searching through several old archives, an employee returned carrying a large folder filled with yellowed blueprints. Michael spread them across the table, scanning each page until his hand suddenly stopped moving. The layout on the old plans didn't match the house we were standing in. Behind the wall we'd been examining was a narrow hallway that no longer existed. At some point, decades earlier, someone had completely sealed that section off during one of the renovations. Neither of us said much on the drive back. The footsteps were still happening every night, and now we knew part of the original house had simply disappeared from the current layout. The question was obvious. Why would anyone erase an entire hallway instead of remodeling it? Just as we started unloading a few tools from Michael's truck, someone called out from the driveway. It was the elderly woman from across the street. She looked at the blueprints in Michael's hands, then at the wall beside the staircase. Her expression changed immediately. "Please don't tear that wall open," she said calmly. "Not until you hear the whole story." Michael slowly lowered the toolbox without taking his eyes off her. Whatever she was about to say, he had clearly never heard it before. She stepped inside, placed her purse on the kitchen table, and looked directly at Michael. "Do you actually know why your grandfather closed that hallway?" she asked. He quietly shook his head. She took a slow breath before answering. "Because the truth was easier to hide than to explain." For the first time since I'd arrived, the mystery no longer seemed to be about the footsteps. It was becoming a story about Michael's family and whatever had happened inside this house long before either of us was born. The woman remained silent for a few seconds before speaking. "People around here always believed your grandfather sealed that hallway because he was afraid of something," she said. Then she slowly shook her head. That was never true. He wasn't afraid of the house. He was trying to protect someone. Michael frowned. "Protect who?" She looked out the kitchen window before answering. "Your father." The room fell completely silent. Michael had never heard that version of the story. Neither had I. Whatever happened in this house had started long before he inherited it. She explained that, decades earlier, the house had looked completely different. Before the renovations, a narrow hallway connected the bedrooms to a small back entrance that opened toward the hillside. Every night, Michael's grandfather would walk that hallway before locking the back door and checking the property one last time. When your father was a little boy, she continued, he waited every night until he heard those footsteps. It became part of his routine. As long as he heard his father walking through the house, he knew everything was safe. Eventually, he would fall asleep without ever leaving his bed. Years later, after your grandfather passed away, the hallway was removed during the expansion. But by then, everyone had become so focused on the strange noises that nobody remembered why those footsteps had mattered in the first place. The story slowly turned into a local legend, and the real memories were buried underneath it. Michael stared at the old blueprints lying on the table. "My dad never told me any of this," he whispered. The woman smiled sadly. "He probably wanted you to remember the house, not the grief that came with it." Even after hearing her explanation, one question still refused to leave my mind. If the hallway had disappeared decades ago, why were we still hearing footsteps every single night? The memories explained the past, but they didn't explain the sounds. The woman nodded, almost as if she'd been waiting for that question. "Because everyone has been looking in the wrong direction," she said. "Those footsteps were never inside the house." Michael and I looked at each other without saying a word. She walked toward the back door and asked us to follow her. Outside, the evening air was cool and the forest behind the property was almost completely silent. She pointed toward a narrow strip of land running along the hillside. "That used to be the old service trail," she said. "It passed almost level with the roof of the original cabin," she continued. "After the renovations, the shape of the house changed, but the sound didn't. For the first time, I felt like we were finally standing one step away from the truth." We followed the old trail behind the property until we reached a small clearing overlooking the house. From there, the original cabin would have been almost level with the ground. Michael unfolded the blueprints once more, comparing them to the landscape in front of us. That's when he suddenly stopped walking. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. He pointed toward the spot where my bedroom now stood. According to the original plans, that room hadn't even existed. It had been added decades later, directly beneath the section of roof closest to the old trail. The engineer's message suddenly made perfect sense. My brain had been placing the sound above me simply because that's where it echoed the loudest. In reality, the footsteps had been traveling through the roof, the walls, and the hollow spaces created during the renovations before reaching my bedroom. We didn't want to rely on guesses, so Michael called my engineer friend and explained everything we'd discovered. 2 days later, he arrived with sound measuring equipment and spent the afternoon testing different areas around the property. By sunset, he was smiling. He asked Michael to walk along the old trail while the rest of us stayed inside the house. The moment Michael reached the section closest to the roof, I heard it. The exact same footsteps, same rhythm, same direction, same sound I'd been hearing every night since I arrived. I ran outside before Michael could finish the test. Standing only a few feet away from him, I could barely hear his footsteps. But the moment I stepped back into the bedroom, they sounded as if someone was walking directly above my head. It was one of the strangest acoustic effects I'd ever experienced. The engineer explained that the combination of the hillside, the original wooden beams, and the later expansion had created a natural echo chamber. Under the right conditions, sounds from the trail were funneled through the structure and amplified over that one bedroom. It was rare, but completely real. There was only one question left. "Who was walking that trail every night at exactly 2:16? I asked. The elderly woman smiled softly before answering. "You're about to meet him." A few minutes later, an elderly man appeared at the far end of the trail carrying a flashlight and a small backpack. He waved at the woman as if they had known each other forever. Michael looked confused. "Who's that?" he asked. "His name is Walter," she replied. "He's been walking this trail every night for nearly 20 years. None of us said a word. Suddenly, the mystery wasn't about the footsteps anymore. It was about the man who had unknowingly created them." Walter smiled when he saw Michael.
"You must be Daniel's son," he said. Michael looked surprised. "You knew my father?" Walter nodded. "For more than 40 years. He spoke with the kind of calm that only comes from carrying the same routine for a very long time."
He explained that he had worked as a forest ranger when he was younger. Long before the new houses were built, that trail was part of his nightly patrol. Every evening he walked the exact same route to check for fallen trees, small fires, or injured hikers who might need help before sunrise.
"When I retired," Walter said, "I thought about stopping." He glanced toward the forest before smiling to himself. But after walking that trail every night for nearly 30 years, staying home felt wrong, so he kept going. Not because anyone asked him to, simply because it had become part of who he was.
Michael stood there without saying a word. Walter looked toward the house and quietly added, "Your father used to wait for my flashlight every night." I frowned, confused. Walter noticed my expression and continued. Seeing that light pass through the trees meant I was out there, and that everything around the house was safe.
As the years passed, the houses changed, the trail disappeared from the maps, and new families moved into town. But Walter never changed his routine. None of us realized that every step he took was still traveling through the hillside and echoing inside a house that no longer resembled the one he had protected decades earlier.
Michael slowly walked over and shook Walter's hand. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Michael smiled and said, "All these years, I thought I was chasing a mystery." Walter smiled back. "Sometimes the answer has been quietly walking beside us the whole time."
A few months later, Michael renovated the section of the house that had been amplifying the sound. The footsteps disappeared completely, but every now and then, just before sunset, he'd sit on the back porch with a cup of coffee and watch a small flashlight moving through the trees in the distance. Walter never knew he'd been the center of a mystery that had puzzled so many people over the years, and maybe that was the most beautiful part of the story. Sometimes an ordinary life leaves behind extraordinary memories without ever realizing it. I still think about that week whenever someone tells me they found an Airbnb that seems too good to be true. The cheapest place I ever rented didn't leave me with a ghost story. It left me with something far more valuable. A reminder that not every mystery hides something frightening. Sometimes it hides a person worth remembering. Before I left town, Michael asked me to walk the old trail with him one last time. We followed Walter's familiar route in complete silence. It wasn't a long walk, but for the first time I understood why someone could repeat the same path for decades without ever growing tired of it. When we reached the highest point overlooking the house, Michael stopped and looked back. "You know what's strange?" he said. "For years, I blamed this place for making me afraid. But the house was never the problem." He smiled quietly. It was the stories I kept telling myself. A few weeks later, Michael sent me a photo. The renovations were finished, the old acoustic echo had disappeared, and the Airbnb was fully booked again. This time, though, every guest received a handwritten note inside the welcome folder telling the true history of the house and the old trail behind it. It never mentioned ghosts or strange noises. Instead, he wrote about his grandfather, his father, and Walter. About routines, memories, and how easily ordinary events can become mysteries once the people who live them are gone. Somehow, that story was far more interesting than any haunted house could have been. I still have that handwritten note folded inside one of my books. Every time I come across it, I remember something Walter told us before we said goodbye. Most mysteries disappear the moment someone cares enough to ask the right question. I've never forgotten those words. That trip gave me exactly what I'd been looking for. Not a quiet vacation, but a story I'll probably tell for the rest of my life. And whenever I hear someone dismiss an old rumor without looking any deeper, I can't help but smile. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's simply been waiting for someone willing to listen.